There we go.
Okay. So welcome to our fellowship assembly for November. Um, and welcome from Ajijic, Mexico, where we will be until the latter part of April. And I do want to welcome our guest, Bill Gordon. Bill, just wave. So Bill is from the Fort Saskatchewan Rotary Club and is considering joining our club as of January after that club folds. So we're really happy to have you here this morning, Bill. Um, Happy that our speaker for this morning is our very own AnnLisa. AnnLisa, wave so that everybody knows who you are. AnnLisa is an Indigenous Conservation Program Manager with Nature Conservancy of Canada. She's past president of the Rotary Club of Spruce Grove. Previously, AnnLisa held the role of advisor reconciliation, focusing on Indigenous and rural relations for the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo. Additionally, AnnLisa served as a counselor for the Division 1 in Parkland County. And we're really happy to have AnnLisa tell us all about her work and what she does. So you take it from here, AnnLisa.
Sure. So I do have a PowerPoint that I just want to put up here.
I'll just remind everyone to mute themselves too, please.
I really appreciate the introduction. You saved me a slide, so thanks for that. And I'm really happy to be here today. So Tanzi, good matin. Good morning. Happy to present today, and I'm very pleased to be part of this club since May of 2025. So thank you, Judy. In meetings, it's important to begin by acknowledging the traditional and ancestral territory on which we live. So I'll begin the meeting in a good way and then move on to today's presentation. I respectfully acknowledge that I'm speaking today from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Nehiyaw, which is Cree, Dene, Anishinaabe, Nakota Sioux, Nitstapi, which is Blackfoot, Iroquois, and the Iroquois. I acknowledge this home. This land is home to the Otipemisiwak Métis government, as well as Métis settlements within the historic Northwest Métis homeland. And this area is home to one of the largest communities of Inuit south of the 60th parallel. I have gratitude for the histories, languages, and cultures of Indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land from time immemorial, and acknowledge elders and knowledge holders who are no longer with us and those that guide my path today. So I recognize that some Rotarians are joining us on unceded land in what we call British Columbia, and treating unceded land in Ontario, as well as from Treaty 7 in the south of what we call Alberta, which is Blackfoot Treaty 7 territory, the lands of the Nitstapi nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Iarhe, Stoney Nakoda nations, and Tsuut'ina Nation. I encourage you all who are from other places as well to reflect on whose territories you are on right now and how you can contribute meaningfully to the recognition of the truth of our history, the decolonization of systems and structures that hold back Indigenous peoples today, and how we can journey together in a good way for future generations on Turtle Island and Mother Earth. So land acknowledgement is usually offered by a non-Indigenous person in meetings and gatherings. I'm accustomed to offering them in situations such as these, and happy to do the one today. I wasn't exactly sure what to present on, and recognize that we have members of our club that do not live in Canada, so decided to focus on the history of colonization and where we are at today in a space of reconciliation and decolonization as we move forward to recognize the work we have as a country ahead. So to be honest, half an hour is not enough time. Usually these types of talks are a day, full day or 2 days about our history. So this is a very, very brief synopsis of a few important points. It's a very high level discussion. I encourage you to further your journey to understanding, knowledge, and your individual path to reconciliation after today. And I'm very happy to offer myself as a resource moving forward. So you may find information you already know, which is terrific. It may be placed in a different context, or you are not familiar with what I'm speaking about, which is even better. We don't know what we don't know, and certainly the history of our country has not been covered well in schools and in everyday life in Canada, though things have gotten more coverage in the last few years, especially after the residential school discovery of children a few years ago. So I'll speak more about Métis later in the presentation. I'm not sure what everyone knows about me. I am Métis on my mother's side and Danish on my father's. I grew up in this area outside of Edmonton. I just recently moved back from Calgary, Mohkinstsis. I went to school on Enoch Cree Nation, all of my elementary and junior high school years, living adjacent to the community my entire life. My family is Red River Métis. I have many grandmothers who are Cree and Stoney Lakota, and men who are Scottish, whom I honor as I speak. I am a citizen of the Otipemisiwak Métis government of the Métis Nation of Alberta. This is a picture here of my great-grandmother Setter, my great-great-grandmother, and some of my aunties. So I moved up north about 6 years ago, where I worked, as Judy mentioned, moved back down to Calgary after a dedicated career in government, joined the NCC board, and then moved into this position in Indigenous conservation and engagement. So I've been engaged in Indigenous relations for well over a decade. So I thought we'd just start with some terminology. I'm really focused on this presentation on the questions that I tend to get and where people can maybe sit in some discomfort. And I want to just take the opportunity to explore some terminology. So a lot of people who would like to talk about Indigenous history with Indigenous peoples may get concerned about what to call the Indigenous and original inhabitants of this land. But proper reference sets an important and respectful tone. In fact, not all Indigenous peoples have settled on a term themselves, which can make it more confusing. It's something that you should just be relaxed about. It is fluid, identity evolves, and it's all okay. Names are linked to identity, and that can be different depending on whether you speak to a First Nations government directly versus an elder or a community member. But what I can never emphasize enough is humility and a willingness to learn, to have an open mind, embody respect and interest in a genuine relationship, ideally in reciprocity. Terms and identity can evolve, and what was appropriate years ago may no longer be so. Sometimes a term can be left behind because it becomes loaded with negative connotation and trauma, and it's really as simple as that. Indigenous peoples are very diverse, and one thing I have learned myself is to just listen and respect what someone chooses to be called. So the term Indian is loaded. I do not recommend ever using it. However, you still may hear an elder refer to themselves in this way. And of course, the Indian Act is still in existence today. They may also call themselves a native. However, I do not suggest using this word either. Aboriginal is referred to in legislation still today as well, as in our Constitution Act of Canada. You'll see some organizations also still have Aboriginal in their name, but the terminology has evolved to Indigenous. It is internationally recognized, in definition can be viewed as appropriate, and it is intended to encompass First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, the three distinct Indigenous peoples in what we now call Canada. And to make things a bit more confusing, in the United States, you will still hear Native American and Indian as acceptable, but in Canada, we have moved to Indigenous. I often hear confusion as to who are the three distinct Indigenous peoples in Canada and who they are, and these definitions are centered in the Constitution Act of Canada, Section 35, as part of the Act that recognizes and affirms Indigenous rights. The Canadian government did not initially plan to include our rights so extensively within the Constitution when the Act was being redrafted in the early 1980s. But through campaigns and demonstrations, Indigenous groups in Canada successfully fought to have our rights enshrined and protected. And it's important to understand that Section 35 recognizes what is termed Aboriginal rights, but it did not create them. Aboriginal rights existed before Section 35. So you will see just some parts of the Constitution Act here. Section 35 recognizes and affirms existing rights, but it doesn't define them. What these rights include have been the topic of much debate and discussion, and they've been defined over time through Supreme Court cases, which include a range of cultural, social, political, and economic rights, including the right to land, as well as to harvest, to practice one's own culture, and to establish treaties. Section 35 falls outside of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and thankfully allows it to be exempt from the notwithstanding clause that applies to the Charter. In other words, the federal government and provincial governments cannot override our rights. So there's actually no legal definition for the term First Nations, and it is a term used to replace the terms Indians and Indian bands beginning in the 70s and 80s, which many found offensive. You can use First Nation community as a respectful alternative phrase. First Nations people include both status and non-status Indians under the Indian Act. First Nations people may live on or off reserve. They may or may not have legal status under the Indian Act, and they may or may not be registered members of a community or nation. So very catch-all for the First Peoples of this land. Métis are descendants of what is now southern Manitoba along the Red River Valley, and Winnipeg, where my ancestors come from, which is recognized as the Northwest Métis homeland. Also, Métis is constitutionally applied to the descendants of communities in what are now Quebec and Labrador. Although these groups' histories are different from that of the Western Métis, there are also Métis in northeastern British Columbia. Métis settlements are recognized only by the Alberta government in Canada, and we have 8 of them in Alberta under the Métis Settlements Act. So 1.24 million acres of land were set aside for Métis people, but this land is largely unpopulated. People with mixed First Nations and European ancestry identify as Métis. Métis organizations in Canada have different criteria about who qualifies as a Métis person. So to be eligible for citizenship, for example, with the Métis Nation of Alberta, the Otipemisiwak Métis government, someone must meet all of the following criteria. So for me, you need to self-identify as Métis, you are of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and you are accepted by the Métis Nation. Inuit are Indigenous people in northern Canada, living mainly in Nunavut, Northwest Territories, northern Quebec, and Labrador. Ontario has a very small Inuit population, as does Alberta. The Edmonton area is home to a larger Inuit population as well. Like the Métis, Inuit are not covered by the Indian Act, and the word Inuit means the people in Inuktitut, and the term by which Inuit refer to themselves. They are known collectively as Inuit Nunungat, which includes land, water, and ice. And the word Eskimo is derogatory and is no longer used. So let's go back far into the colonial history of what we now call Kanata or Canada before we come back to the present. The doctrine of discovery is a legal and religious concept that advanced the idea that European peoples, culture, and religion were superior to all others and that they could invade and subjugate non-Christian lands, people, and sovereign nations, and is still an important legal concept in Canada today. Following Columbus's voyage in 1492, which resulted in Europe learning of the existence of the Americas, Pope Alexander VI issued the first papal bulls, which would become the doctrine of discovery. It gave most of North and South America to Spain, which made the first discovery. So both French and English colonial powers also used the doctrine to claim Indigenous lands and force their cultural and religious beliefs on Indigenous peoples. Land was considered, it's called terra nullius, which is vacant land, if it had not been yet occupied by Christians. Such vacant land could be defined as discovered, and as a result, sovereignty, title, and jurisdiction could be claimed, invalidating the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples, leading to the seizure of lands and their displacement. As large-scale colonial settlements spread over what became Canada, many Indigenous peoples had to enter treaty relationships, defining how they would share the land with the newcomers. Some treaties made out of desperation, as starvation and disease through the extermination of buffalo and in the introduction of European disease, war, and attacks, decimated Indigenous populations. Influenced by the absolute claims to power and authority expressed by the doctrine, Canadian law interpreted these agreements as surrendering title and control, despite these concepts being largely misunderstood and foreign to Indigenous cultures. This doctrine was used by the Spanish, Portuguese, and English, among others, as a framework for the colonization of many places, including regions of Africa and the Americas. It claimed that the presence of Indigenous people on lands did not prevent them from being terra nullius, by arguing that the Indigenous communities occupying the lands, they occupied them, but they did not own them by European definitions of ownership. These principles of terra nullius were adopted to varying degrees into the legal frameworks of colonized countries across the world and continue to impact the rights of Indigenous peoples. The assumption of superiority and dominance embodied in the doctrine of discovery, so it underpins many aspects of Canada's colonial history. This includes the Indian Act, the first Indian residential schools, and the 60 Scoop. So you may have heard calls from Indigenous peoples when Pope Francis was here in 2022 to apologize for the Catholic Church's role and to rescind the doctrine of discovery. And in March 2023, the Vatican did officially repudiate the doctrine of discovery, but the Church stopped short of rescinding the papal bulls, which is what the doctrine is based on. So this may not necessarily mean significant change in Canadian law, but it allows the use of treaties and nation-to-nation relationships to be a foundation moving forward. We are treaty people in Canada, and the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius in Canada has also supported parks creation and the idea of conservation land and resulting displacement. And this is the exact space that I also work in today, in a place of reconciliation, reconnection, and correction. So I don't have time to discuss the Royal Proclamation of 1963, but it was another key time when the British acknowledged that they likely needed Indigenous peoples to help them fight the South. And once this was no longer as needed, Indigenous peoples were cast aside, and dark days began through the eradication of buffalo, widespread disease, stolen land, the negotiations of treaties, reserve creation, and the introduction of the Indian Act and the residential school system. So I'm skipping over here very, very key points in our history in the interest of time. The British North American Act led to Canada being a country in 1867, then gave the government to make authority to make laws at who were called Indians at the time, and the very small pieces of land reserved for Indians to be forced onto. And as this book, it's a very good book, states, the tragic reality is that what should have been a positive and respectful code of conduct degenerated over time, one in which government policies led to cultural genocide, assimilation, theft of land, denial of treaty and constitutional rights, racism, and increasingly punitive laws meant to control every aspect of the lives and deaths of the original inhabitants of what is now Canadian territory. So this book here, you may have seen, it's a really important read, as the Indian Act is still in full force today in Canada and impacts First Nations people in many different ways. Again, too much to get into today, but I encourage you all to read it to understand the fact this act is still a reality in 2025, and that requires consideration from every Canadian. And a quote from this book is that if Canada and Canadians are to reconcile with Indigenous peoples, then the existing relationship, the one based on the Indian Act, has to be rebuilt. The past cannot be overlooked or dismissed as ancient history, because it isn't, and all of these impacts are still ongoing. As required by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Crown, through their representatives of the Dominion of Canada, needed to enter into formal treaty processes before they could continue their expansion westward. So the British Crown and First Nations interpreted the meaning and intention of treaties in very different ways, as the First Nations, as an oral people, took the Crown negotiations at their word, and of course didn't fully understand English or the written word, along with the concept of money, land ownership, and a myriad of other deceptions. And the British Crown considered the number treaties to be exchanged for the surrender of Indigenous rights and title to the land, so settlers from foreign lands could occupy them within the colonial territories that the British laid claim to. And in return, the Crown guaranteed First Nations certain treaty and inherent rights in perpetuity. So there are 11 numbered treaties in Canada and some lands that are not under treaty and were never ceded, such as in British Columbia. And in Alberta, we have 3 treaty areas. Treaty 8 is up north, Treaty 6 is in what we call Central Alberta, and then Blackfoot Treaty 7 territory is in the south. And it's hard to see, it's fuzzy, but I do have the PDF of all of the Métis settlements within, as well as all of the First Nations in Alberta. So these are just some facts. Where the original population was for Indigenous peoples when newcomers arrived to what we call Canada, and the reduction through various interventions that reduce the numbers of our people down so severely. In the US, you may be familiar as well with colonization there. I just put a couple facts in there about how Indian people were subjugated down in the States, and the number of deaths. And of course, our people relied very much on buffalo. He is everything. and buffalo roamed most of North America. And then there was a dedicated attempt to exterminate the population for commercial use, but also intended to push First Nations people and the Métis down to a place where they were willing and able to negotiate into treaties. So less than 1,000 buffalo remained in a century. And thankfully, the remaining animals were hidden and they were able to be brought back. And that is a very important journey ahead for cultural resurgence, as well as food sovereignty, as he is the source of our stories, our culture, and our spirit. Did you know that the last federally funded residential school closed in 1997? So over 160 years, approximately 150,000 children were removed from their communities, most often by force, and placed in residential schools far from home. I have yet to meet an elder or a knowledge holder who was not in residential school, who suffered untold and often unspoken levels, I get emotional, of degradation, devastating separation from their families and their culture and their tradition, and subjected to all forms of abuse. This intergenerational trauma and impact is a legacy for every single First Nations person and many Inuit and Métis and Inuit people today. So a quote from the National Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that perhaps the most detrimental effect of the residential schools was the children's loss of all ability to speak their own language, effectively breaking the means of communication and traditional knowledge sharing between parents and their children. Furthermore, children were taught at school that their culture was somehow inferior and not worth preserving. As a result, the residential schools disrupted the passing of traditional beliefs, skills, and knowledge from one generation to the next, and deliberately separated the children from their heritage by encouraging them to resent it and embrace more European outlook and belief system. So from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report that heard and documented hundreds of survivors' stories for a number of years, the 94 calls to action for truth and reconciliation were created. And I encourage you to look them up. We haven't advanced as quickly as we should in a country in addressing them, but it was a place to start. That is the website for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Does have a really, really good website where you can read survivors' stories, as well as I just mentioned, the calls to action. The intergenerational trauma continues today, and that's where all Canadians, we need to recognize the truth of this country and move forward in a good way in a path of reconciliation. So missing and murdered women, suicide rates exponentially higher than non-Indigenous populations, limitations to the creation of intergenerational wealth and economic advancement still due to the Indian Act, disproportionately lower education and healthcare standards provided by the government, and so on. I wrap my arms around my two-spirit kin, my son's community, who this past week saw their rights stripped away once again, and are made to feel unvalued and unworthy. And it's not up to Indigenous peoples only to demand change. It is up to individuals to determine his or her or their place in allyship, care, and respect for Indigenous peoples and communities, and what true reconciliation in Canada looks like moving forward. There is tremendous opportunity to decolonize and dismantle systems and structures that hold Indigenous peoples back in Canada, to support their rights to self-determination, self-government, reestablish systems that keep societies intact and functioning well, and that were functioning well for millennia. Acknowledging the truth of our country's colonial history is the first step, but tangible action is true reconciliation. Indigenous peoples are strong, we are resilient, we are still here, and the future, I believe, will be bright, and it has to be for future generations. So I'll end here. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. If there's any way I can provide assistance and resources and supports, no question ever will offend. I'm here, if you ever want to text or call and enter into dialogue to further understanding and determine perhaps, how you would like to sit in this space. I welcome that. This picture here was taken with our staff in the summer. this past summer at Blackfoot Crossing on Siksika Nation, where this is the exact location where Treaty 7 was signed. And it's a pretty amazing place if you ever get the chance to head down to Siksika and look at the museum and the many artifacts that they have collected there and the stories that they tell. So there are beautiful locations like Métis Crossing, listed as one of the top destinations in the world, just outside of Edmonton and Smoky Lake County, as well as many beautiful Indigenous-led tourism spaces that you can visit and read about. So the internet's a great resource. There's lots of books, podcasts, films. I'm going to a new film on Sunday night by Tasha Hubbard called Meadowlarks. There's different places it's premiering. So my son is an Indigenous filmmaker. There's incredible films and videos and lots that can be found online. So I appreciate the opportunity, and it's heavy stuff, but it's important that we all understand the history of Canada and how we can move forward in truth and reconciliation. So thank you, Judy.
Oh, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for AnnLisa or comments? No? Oh, maybe everybody's still on mute.
Sorry, here I am trying to talk.
Yeah.
Did you see Angel's comment, AnnLisa?
No, I couldn't read the
It's
chat.
in the chat. It's in the chat. He
Okay.
was just wondering if he could have a copy of your presentation to send to his children.
Oh, of course. You bet. I can encapsulate my notes too, so that you have the slides and the notes.
The
I'd
thing
just
is
like-
that your presentation is not only Canadian, it also applies to the Spanish one. And try to help us to avoid this thing as, hey, the Spanish thing must apologize for the colonization. The things must be resolved one way or another. Yeah?
Awesome. Thanks, Angel.
I think you're so right. This is just a tip of the iceberg, a very little tip on AnnLisa, and I think we'd all benefit from learning more about what you've talked about.
Yeah, happy to.
Yeah, I'd like to receive a copy of your presentation. Is this a shorter presentation just for the time on the internet type of thing, or do you have a longer one?
Yeah, sorry, Jim. I don't myself. There are people that do this. So what I did is I created this presentation myself just to stay within the 30 minutes over the past few days. But I'm more of a resource, so it's like if you want to learn about this or ask questions, but I don't formally offer cultural awareness training as part of my role. We do have our in different organizations now, more and more, they will have a more formalized Indigenous learning course or modules that new employees have to go through, should go through and want to go through. And then there are resources on the web that you can look into, but I don't offer training myself, but happy to be offering, support to and guidance and advice to Rotary. And if anybody wants me to expand on it, happy to do that as well.
AnnLisa, I have one question. In your presentation, you alluded to treaty people, like we are treaty people. As a white Caucasian with Scottish descent who came over to Nova Scotia from Scotland and England through the Mayflower and all that, would I be is it okay for me to call myself a treaty person?
Yeah.
Like where I'm on the unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people.
Yes, and you are on unceded land, so that makes it a bit different. But when I say that, and you'll hear people say that we are all treaty people, is that it centers and is intended to place non-Indigenous people with Indigenous people, that the foundation of this country was negotiated around treaty that allowed what has happened for all of us today to live, most of it to be in abundance, and the lifestyle and the lives that we live and the way that we have progressed as a society is based on those treaty obligations. And it's a reminder and a question to everybody: have those treaty obligations been fulfilled? That is our obligation to ensure. So people want to say sometimes, well, treaties are, they're bad, and that Indigenous people were reluctant and they were forced, and to some extent they were starving, and there was impetus for some treaty signings. But in the end, Treaty is the foundation of what formed this country, what handed over the lands and surrender. I wouldn't even use surrender because we don't believe we surrendered the lands that allowed development and expansion to happen. That is why, especially in Alberta, you are hearing such a fight back from the treaty nations and the chiefs of this province that there can be no separation because we are a treaty country. Our relationship is to the British Crown. It is not to the provinces. So that treaty relationship is very sacred and held very dearly to First Nations people and to the Métis and Inuit as well, who aren't technically under the Indian Act. So yes, I would love that every Canadian feels that way in their heart, because that's what reconciliation means, and understanding of our history.
And Lisa, the 1990s and the end of residential schools, that effectively means that anyone in the Native communities who's, say, 30 and less, younger, has only the story of residential schools rather than having lived them. So I suspect that within about another 25 to 30 years, we will finally have moved beyond the sort of generations of people who were subjected to that sort of environment. And it's just a curious thought in my head of how the communities at that point in time will have developed into something new or different. I mean, I'm probably not expressing that very well, but I suspect that, you know, when you have not lived that problem, the sort of approach that you would take going forward would be fundamentally different from the people that have lived that problem. What do you think of that kind of concept?
If communities can be rebuilt and supported to repair the intergenerational harm, the resulting addiction, abuse, disease, the community structure breakdown that's occurred purposefully, with supports from all of us. Some of those communities are pretty bad, dire straits, you know, because people left those schools with such shame, trauma, abuse, not knowing how to parent, not knowing how to be emotionally and physically healthy. They lived in residential school for 12 years. Some of them were dropped off on a street with no money, you know? So then they come back to a community they're completely unfamiliar with. And it's human nature and psyche that that's not a healthy place to be, you know? So it's really, and that you think that they have no supports, no psychiatrists, no medical care on reserve. Like how do you heal from that level of trauma? How do you parent well? How do you rebuild community? So that's my hope too, you know, Keith, but there's a lot of work. And I see, that's why I go to powwows. That's what I hope. I watch these beautiful young parents parenting, and Indigenous people are the fastest growing population in Canada, remain, even though the epidemic rates of suicide is impacting. There is, you know, a lot of hope there. Absolutely, Keith. And I hold that hope dear, but, you know, there needs to be good financial supports, good programs, self-government, self-governance, so that you're willing as a society to let Indigenous people go back to the way they governed their cultures, save their language, save their, you know, and raise really, really healthy kids and communities moving forward. That's my hope and dream too. Because every single person you speak to is either been in residential school or as a child of a residential school survivor.
That's I mean, they would still be, you know, the majority of that sort of population demographic, but we're getting to the stage of the next generation not having that, you know, the kids of the people that you just, you know, the powwow kids are growing up in a fundamentally different environment than would have been the case for their parents and certainly their grandparents, right?
I would challenge that you go on to a lot of nations and you probably won't see good positive change for generations.
Really? Okay. Well, that's sad.
But others are, you know,
yeah,
because they live, a lot of them, in poverty, you know.
Yeah.
So when you have no hope, and you have no thought of how you can even leave a reserve, you know, and you have no housing and you have no capacity under the Indian Act to create intergenerational wealth. They don't even own their homes still in 2025. The government owns the land. They own the housing, right? It's given to them. So how can you start a business? How can you as an individual live at like every other Canadian when you're still subjected to the Indian Act as the oppressor? How can you have a resilient community when you are living on a reserve? And they don't want to get the reserves are what they have, right? So I just would really challenge everybody to think that that is still the reality in 2025, and nothing has changed until the Indian Act is addressed and until everybody's brought up to the same level for economic opportunity. You know, it gets really hard to pull yourself and your family and your community out of that. How many nations still don't have drinkable water? You know, so we have to be challenging our politicians and our, you know, our programs and dismantling systems and structures and just giving that control back to communities because really they still don't have it.
Wow.
Yeah. I had worked up in Wabasca for 4 years for Big Stone Cree Nation.
Oh boy.
So met lots of great people up there, very accomplished people, had gone to university, very successful. And then some of the residents up there went sort of the opposite way, where there was quite a bit of alcohol abuse and drugs and that type of thing. It's a very, very complex issue, isn't it?
It is. It really is complex. And people come to me and say, well, how would you solve? Like, I don't have that answer. I wish I did. But you just have to take a short trip out to Paul First Nation to see how they live and then go on to Enoch Cree, right? So there's also, you know, it's breaking that cycle, like Keith has said, but it'll take generations, but it also takes, you know, and the Indian Act also really created so chiefs and councils, that's not the way that Indigenous communities were governed for millennia. It imposed basically a municipal elected system, which became very patriarchal because of changes to the Indian Act that disenfranchised Indigenous women to a point now where they're the most marginalized demographic in the world. And those were foreign thoughts, you know, and so that's only 150, 200 years in the making. And how do you undo that and try to, so there, it's not, doesn't feel right and natural. So you're also trying to govern in a way that's odd. You're trying to build economic opportunity in a way that's odd. Education has been very difficult. I mean, I grew up going to school on Enoch, but I never heard any Cree, you know, so education levels proportionately are not funded as well on First Nations. And like you say, Jim, you can come and many communities members will go out and go to university, but then they come back to try to build their community, but there's some challenges there too. So yeah.
Some resentment as well.
Pardon?
Some resentment from other Native people,
Sure,
right?
it
In
can
the
happen.
community.
It can
Yeah.
happen. I don't see it as much in the South, you know, in Blackfoot nations. They've got incredible capacity. And the way that they build their departments and welcome back and educate their youth. But other nations, they just don't have that, especially in more rural areas. They don't, you know, transportation's hard. How do you help a kid whose parents have no wealth go to school, right? And then what do they come back to? Like it's sometimes it can feel very unsurmountable for young Indigenous youth to come back and build their communities. So, you know, it's all of us wrapping our arms around that and keeping them in mind and how that can be supported. And, you know, that, you know, but it's a Western education. And that's the space I sit in, is a two-eyed seeing space where you have your Western science, but you have Indigenous knowledge, Blackfoot science, Blackfoot, you know, astrology, like how do you blend those knowledge systems together? Because a Western education isn't necessarily what an Indigenous youth wants, right?
Can I ask you another question? I mean, I've got an academic background in the past at university levels, and I'm embarrassed that I don't know the answer to the question that I'm going to ask. In Canada, are there universities that have really good Indigenous studies faculties, programs?
Yeah, there are from, Western, Athabasca University has a really good, it's the degree I pursued in Indigenous Studies. RECCO College, right on Kaina, so Blood Tribe, has it's an Indigenous-led college. University of Lethbridge, under Provost Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who's just so dear to me. He also helped write the Constitution Act. He helped form UNDRIP. He helped, he's an esteemed legal scholar. University of Lethbridge is making incredible strides. University of Alberta, there are several First Nations professors, Dr. James Makokas, Lana Whiskey Jack in Gender Studies, Tasha Hubbard, who's premiering her film on Sunday. Those are strong Indigenous doctors who work at the university and guide the faculty of Native Studies there. So yeah, it's coming,
And sorry, I don't mean to hog questions. And the people who go there, is it a mix of non-Indigenous and Indigenous, so that it's not just Indigenous people that are beginning to learn what they need to learn on this subject?
Yeah, I know a lot of people who have an Indigenous history degree that are non-Indigenous. Yeah,
Okay.
that have chosen it. Yeah, several people. Yeah,
that has to be a good thing, right? Because then it sort of becomes more than just an Indigenous sort of issue. When people that can speak knowledgeably and who aren't Indigenous, it cannot be a bad thing.
A lot of the consultants whom I work with, even at NCC, they're not Indigenous and they work in this space. So
Good.
very well. Yeah, they're fantastic people. Yeah.
Can I add something? When I was in UK, I chaired the admissions committee for the Faculty of Medicine, and it was during that period when we negotiated with the treaty nations to create an additional stream for entry for Indigenous students into medicine. And I don't know how that program is going now because I've been retired for a few years. But we created that stream listening to what the treaty nations felt was the appropriate way to go. So we didn't drop this at their behest. We did not drop the standards for entry, but we created a separate stream. So once they were in, they were just part of the class. But they definitely had an impact on the rest of the class because they brought their culture with them. And I saw a lot of cross sort of education going on amongst that group. And I think, well, in all the period that I was there, we only ever had one First Nation student who failed to graduate. And all the rest were incredibly successful and went on. Some of them did go back to their own communities, and some of them took on important leadership roles within their communities. And that was a real education for me. I mean, we had to train because for medicine, you have to go through a very rigorous interview process to get in, as well as looking at the grades and everything. And what was fascinating is we had to teach the interviewers how to interact with the applicants, because initially we started to get comments on, failed to make eye contact with the interviewers, and we weren't sure how to interpret what they were really doing. And then they had to be educated to the fact that that would be considered extremely disrespectful from the applicants to make direct eye contact with the interviewers. And as a consequence, we really had to train up a group of interviewers who understood the cultural implications of that interaction. But as far as I know, that program is still strong and going well. And that was done in complete collaboration with the treaty nations in Alberta.
Fantastic. There's so much good going on. That's a wonderful example. It's a beautiful space to be discovering and working together in. And there's just incredible. I sat with them. I was down in Calgary at a Métis National Council Nature Summit where they unveiled their nature strategy the past 2 days. And the scholars and the elders and the youth and the people that are in that room to, around a conservation and climate change and the number of programs that are going on the land, to, like you're mentioning, educational institutions, to you see more and more Indigenous lawyers and judges and incredibly creative people that, are just doing incredible stuff. It's really shifted over the past few years in terms of visibility of that. So thank you for that. That's really encouraging to hear.
AnnLisa, I just have a question. With the popularity of Ancestry.com and these DNA testing sites, have you seen more people that have found out that they have an Aboriginal bloodline that contact your organizations?
Well, the Métis Nation, the Alpitimsiwak government actively, encourage people to look. You have to provide genealogy. You have to really demonstrate your ties to the homeland. So, but what makes you Métis is different than what a First Nations person is versus who is Inuit. So it's when you hear that someone is Métis, you'll not ever hear somebody, I'm 1/5 Cree. That we are our own people and we are of mixed ancestry. And I tell my kids that it doesn't matter. It matters to me who my grandmothers were. So when you're Métis, to become Métis, it also has to be on the mother's side. So you're demonstrating that. And those women, were often taken from reserve. They were married to Scottish, in my family, Scottish men, could be English, could be French. So the way that we look at being Métis is very different. So to me, Ancestry.com doesn't matter other than to learn about my relatives. You may have heard this week, and my heart breaks about Thomas King, this week. Him at 82, just like Buffy St. Marie, realizing that they have no Indigenous blood, but yet have built a career and a literary career or a music career around the assumption that they were. And that's really hard. So you'll see more of that as well, where people, especially in the States, say, well, I'm part Cherokee, or premier saying I'm part whatever, and they aren't, right? So I guess there's value to seeking that out, and learning about your lineage. But, yeah, there's a lot more of that where people, I think, are like, well, I'm 1/25 Mi'kmaq. That's wonderful. That's amazing, because you're learning about your genealogy, you're learning about who you are as a person. And I really support that. It's what you do with that and how you portray that and your to community and your history and your ties that, and how you live. That's what matters to me. Yeah.
So just so I understand, you're only Métis through your mother?
Yeah, you have to become Métis, you have to show First Nation lineage through your matriarchal side. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. And what happened to make Métis a distinct people is something that I would encourage. There's a beautiful book called The Northwest is My Mother, written by Jean Tallet, who is Louis Riel's, I think she's his niece. And that's a really good read about the evolution of the Métis people in what we call Canada. And because we really focus on First Nations history, as we should in Canada, but the Métis people, it's an incredible journey and story. And we're in the process right now of seeking self-government for the first time under federal legislation. So pretty cool. Yeah.
So, AnnLisa, I know you know, but probably the rest don't know that Ron, my husband, is also Métis.
Yes.
And it's from his great-great-grandfather, who came here from Scotland with the Hudson Bay Company to the Red River Valley, to the Red River. And his wife who became his wife was a Cree woman. And then there's also on the other side of the family, or I guess is way back then, was another Cree person that came into the family. And so he's just recently applied for his Métis status in Alberta.
As an elder.
As an elder, and I say he'll be an elder. And he's pretty proud about that, right?
I haven't received the documentation yet.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'll be an elder, but you'll get your documentation, and that's important. You get your card. Absolutely. You have to, the way the Métis view elders is, yeah, but it's something to attain for sure.
And the Brown family, his cousins, and they've all applied for their Métis status as well. None of them knew that they were Métis. I guess his father knew, and on that side, but I think that his grandmother didn't want anybody to know that she was married to a Métis. So none of the children, like his father and his father's siblings, didn't know that they were Aboriginal at all, that they had any, and it was later that they found out, and now they've all, become, applied for their status, and they're very proud to be Métis. So.
Yeah, my family, it took them a while to learn as well, though I find it hilarious. I'm like, did you guys never look in the mirror? Like, my goodness. Grandpa's playing the fiddle. But yeah, it's there was a lot of shame around being Métis a few decades ago. There was a lot of franchisement and shame associated with being Métis, and that's why it's so beautiful to sit in a room like I did yesterday and see so many proud Métis. And yeah, it's been a journey for sure to nationhood. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this incredible presentation. I know we were supposed to have other things happening in this meeting, but this is so important. I think that we're going to have some of our members talk about their favorite Rotary moment, but I might have to put that to another meeting just because I think this was really, really important to hear.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and Lisa, I think it's important to say that I personally think that the club is very enriched by having you as a member. And I hope that we're giving you the feeling that, that is the case, and that we're doing something to enrich your life as well from the Rotarian perspective. So
I'm grateful for that. Thank you so much, Keith. When I was with Rotary with Spruce Grove a few years ago, I became involved with Arlene Monahan kind of on the grassroots beginning conversations of Indigenous cultural awareness for the district. And there was a committee formed. I was part of that. And then I tried to, introduce our in-person club with Spruce Grove to different Indigenous speakers and really be thoughtful with a subcommittee on our club, at our club, ways that we could be supportive of Indigenous communities peripherally around Parkland County or within Parkland County, but also on a Rotary journey too. So yeah, I'm curious to see where those things are at these days, but there's a lot of opportunity to make sure that our club members are aware of the history of Canada, but also the communities that we that are part of our areas and how we can be building good friendship and relationships with them. But I appreciate your words, Keith. Thank you so much. And I'm very grateful to be part of this club.
I just want to say something, AnnLisa, that as you look at my friend, Keith, as he's sitting in his office, something that you're not aware of, you can see right behind his head, there's a beautiful piece of artwork. And I can assure you that his home is filled with Innu art. He has soapstone, he has pieces on his wall, and that's been his passion, I think, for the biggest part of his adult life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's an out of control passion, Lois. Absolutely.
Yeah, I know.
Thank you for the extra time, Judy. Thank you for the. Thank
You're
you.
welcome, and thank you.
Really interesting.
I guess that we'll just wrap the meeting up at this point, if
Yeah.
okay with everybody.
Yeah.
And
So
I think it was just a wonderful presentation, and we have a lot to think about. And I'm also so glad that you're part of this club and that you are enlightening all of us about the situation. So
my question is, did we scare Bill off? Is he?
No,
Stop
not at all.
recording now.
Good.
I'm going to stop
Sorry, Bill.
recording.
Yeah.
All right.